Okay, so today we are picking up the Rome and Christianity. And the Roman religion was based very similarly to the Greek religion. It was basically they took the Greek gods and renamed them and made them Roman gods. And as time goes on, they change a little bit, gaining different powers or telling different stories. But for the most part, the Roman religion is very, very tolerant. Like I said, they borrowed very much from the Greeks, but with the Greeks, they had no moral code of how you should behave. In fact, the gods and goddesses of the Greek pantheon behave very badly at times. So, not a lot of real world advice on how to behave. There's no promise of an afterlife. They don't really tell you what happens to you after you die. They tell you what happens to the heroes or to the gods, but not a lot about what happens to you as an individual. And so, without these two aspects, typically a religion does die out. And so, what we see happen in Rome is that they're going to have these mystery religions crop up. And these mystery religions are going to try to answer some of those things about morality and the afterlife. And one of these mystery religions is called Mithraism. And Mithra was a sun god. Kind of interesting that his holy day was Sunday. His birthday was December 25th, and he had ceremonial meals in his honor in the spring and in the winter. So there are a lot of correlations with Christianity. However, Mithraism was around a long time before Christianity was. So you can see those correlations. Eventually, the Romans, do get involved with the Jews, and their involvement begins in Judea, which is a province under Roman protection, and it's in the Middle East. And there are going to be divisions within the Jewish community over how they should respond to the Romans, if they should accept them, if they should try and fight them off. There's a lot of differing opinions about that. But eventually, there will be a man who gains a lot of attention, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was a very influential man of the Jews. He preached humility and charity and brotherly love. And this did not always sit well with his Jewish community. The radicals, and radicals are people who want big changes, were very disappointed in Jesus because he wasn't changing enough. But the conservatives, and conservatives are kind of like your old school people, the conservatives were very angry because he was trying to change how their concept of God and what he wanted. And so the Roman authorities in charge of Judea at the time are kind of sketchy about him because they don't want a revolt on their hands that they have to deal with. And the Jewish leaders are not very happy with him because they don't want the change that he's trying to bring. And so he is going to be put on trial. And he's going to be put on trial by Procurator Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate is going to order that he be crucified. Now, crucifixion at this time was not an uncommon punishment. In fact, it was used all the time. It was a way to slowly kill somebody, and so it was considered the worst death possible. So it's not like only Jesus was crucified. Most people that were sentenced to death at this time were crucified. It just happens that it was Jesus that was crucified. But anyway, after his death, that is when Jesus is seen as the Savior God, that he brings about salvation and immortality. And so his words and his ideas are going to be spread mostly by Paul of Tarsus at first. Paul is going to wander through the Middle East and eventually up through the Mediterranean and spread his Jesus' story to non-Jews. And it spread slowly along Roman roads. One of the nice things about the Romans is that they built all these roads, making travel a lot easier, but they also required everybody to know Latin. And so that also is going to make things easier, because when the story of Jesus is written down into the New Testament, it spreads very easily because everybody can understand what's being read to them. And at first, the Romans pay very little attention to this spread of this new religion, but it is very easily communicated because Latin and Greek were common languages, and that's where most of the stories were told. But the Romans eventually, like I said, at first they pay little attention to it, but eventually they begin to fear this new religion because they felt that it was very exclusive. And it is. You have to believe in God and in the salvation offered by Jesus and everything to be a Christian. You can't just say you're a Christian. You actually have to believe that you're Christian. And so the Romans feared that because, they were extremely tolerant. They just basically said, I don't care what you believe. That's fine. You can do whatever you want. But now you have these Christians coming in who's saying, you either have to believe or you just can't be a part of it. And you'll never achieve salvation, and you'll never reach the afterlife, and you'll never know God's love and forgiveness and that kind of stuff. And so, in addition to that, the Christians refused to acknowledge the state gods, the Roman gods. And so this was seen as an act of treason because here we're allowing your religion to exist, but you won't even acknowledge ours, was kind of a huge point of contention. And so for that reason, the Christians are going to be persecuted. Nero, remember Emperor Nero, the crazy dude? He is going to blame the Christians for the fire in Rome, even though most likely he's the one who set the fire. He's going to blame the Christians because he knew everybody would go along with that. He also blames them for the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, that if it wasn't for the Christians, the Romans wouldn't have to go in and destroy Jerusalem. The last persecution of the Christians was done by Diocletian. And actually, eventually, Christianity becomes so popular that it becomes the religion of the state. Constantine will become the first Christian emperor, and he will pass the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan says that the Romans will officially tolerate Christianity. And then you have Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, and he will make Christianity the official religion of the empire. So you go from the Roman religion, where they were extremely tolerant, but they have no direction, to hating Christians because they would not accept their religion and would not include them in theirs, to entirely accepting it and making it the official religion. So it is a huge transformation that takes place. Overall, when we look at Rome's legacies throughout the entire time of their existence, there are several things that they left behind. The first is the cities. The cities that they had helped to spread Roman culture and law. It helped to spread the Latin language because their cities are very uniform. Their temples all look the same. The markets are all placed in the same area. There's the way that their cities are set up makes it very easy for people who travel to find things, that things are typically in the same location. The second of their legacies is their prosperity. Rome had one of the highest levels of trade in the world at any time, but it was also an unbalanced trade, that the East was doing a lot better than the West part was. And remember, the East is the one that carries on. The West kind of fiddles out until later on. The third legacy is that the Greek influence is going to continue with the Romans. Greek slaves were highly wanted because they wanted the Greek musicians and artists and doctors who were very well trained and did well. They wanted that cultural influence. They also liked the Greek tutors and Greek schools in Athens. And so the Greek influence in art and philosophy and religion are all going to continue into the Roman Empire. And so the Greek civilization never really dies out. It just becomes a part of the Roman civilization. The fourth legacy is Roman law. Roman law has had a lot of influence on today and in our own culture as well. They had things like jurists, and a jurist was an amateur legal expert, so it's kind of like a rookie lawyer just learning the ropes, but it was somebody who had more legal experience than you did, so they would argue for you. The emperor was the source of law, that the emperor created the laws, but they could be interpreted. The law of nations was created, that all people living in the Roman Empire were Roman. They weren't Greek, they weren't Spanish, they weren't German, they were all Roman. So if you were living in the Roman Empire, you were Roman, no matter what. So that's a very different way of thinking than even today in our culture, where everybody's either African American or Latino American or German American or whatever. We have a hard time just accepting people as American. Instead, we have to constantly think of them as the subdivision. The fifth legacy is that women's lives do improve, especially in the first century. That at marriage, their dowry, the money and property that came with them, that legal control stayed with their father. It didn't go automatically to their husband. And so that helped to protect the women, because, if the guy just married them for their land and property, he doesn't necessarily have to treat them nicely. And so if it stays with their father, then he still has to treat them nicely if he wants to see any profit from that. They were able to own and inherit and sell their own property. They had divorce rights, that they could ask for a divorce. They could get involved in business, but they couldn't get involved in politics. They were no longer segregated like they were in the Greek society, so they could provide enjoyable company for their husbands as they went out. And education is going to be stressed for both sexes, that it was just as important for a woman to be educated as it was for a man. But the leadership kind of classes were still reserved for boys, because they would need that for the Senate. The sixth legacy is slavery. No other people in history have possessed more slaves than the Romans did. And their major source of slaves were war. They got most of them through war. But it was seen as this public treasury, that this was a way to save people money. But there was very poor treatment of the slaves at times, and there was a lot of fear of slave revolts. In Sicily, there's a large slave revolt, and it took 17,000 Romans and 4 years to put this revolt down. Another revolt is the revolt of Spartacus. Spartacus was a gladiator who led 70,000 slaves to try to get to freedom. He is defeated by the Roman Empire, but along the way, he was winning up until he actually is captured. So he was doing very well. The seventh legacy is Christianity, and Christianity becomes the state religion, like I said, and it helped to establish churches, and it helped to establish the hierarchy of like bishops and cardinals and all that stuff. And then it also eventually will develop Roman Catholicism, which is how we know the Catholic system today. The causes for the fall of Rome, there are several things. The first is that military causes, lots of invasions. The Roman army was not as good as it had been in the past. They had hired mercenaries who were untrustworthy at times. The second are political causes, that the government lost the support of the people, that it became authoritative and oppressive. It had a lot of frequent civil war going on, and the division of it into two pieces actually made it weaker. The third are economic causes, that they just heavily taxed people, and slave labor is going to discourage new developments. The fact that you had slaves meant that you didn't have to try hard to make things better, because you had slaves to do it. Who cares if it was done inadequately, or who cares if it was done in an inefficient manner? You had slaves to do it. The fourth is the social causes. There's just a decline in patriotism, a decline in discipline, a decline in devotion to duty. So it all just brings about the end of the Roman Empire. Now, it's not really a dramatic fall. It's more like a slow decline. There's nothing that actually comes in and just conquers them. It's a slow decline. Many things did not change in Italy for hundreds of years to come, and that slow decline into obscurity is what's going to bring about the end of the Roman Empire.